visit here to Galveston, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk to you about this little known but very interesting subject. And I think it's very particularly unique to be talking about this subject here at Ashton Villa, because as we'll talk about later, this building is one that U.S. Grant actually visited during his trip here to Texas. And after the event is over, if you want to go in and see my wife in the parlor up there in front where I have books for sale, you're probably standing in one of the rooms where Ulysses Grant met with the Brown family. And that's something you can't do anywhere else in Texas, is stand in a room where Ulysses S. Grant was present. It's the only thing like that in Galveston. So it's a pretty remarkable place. So let me start by introducing you to U.S. Grant the man. And of course, I think he is probably the all-time ultimate American comeback story. He went from disappointed and depressed store clerk in Illinois in 1861. By the end of the war, he is general-in-chief of the entire United States Army, the highest rank ever, and he'll go on to be United States president for 2 terms. And all that happens from disappointed store clerk to a 2-term president in only 8 years. I don't think there's any other country on earth where that kind of a meteoric rise could happen. As we'll see at the end of his life, there's kind of a meteoric fall as well, but I do think it's a remarkable story that Grant went on and had all these achievements and became the President of the United States. He not only the President of the United States, he becomes the most photographed man in the world in the 19th century. And he ultimately comes to so popular that he appears on the $50 bill. Of course, this is back in the dark ages when we all used paper money. You will recognize that face from the $50 bill. It's been on there since 1913. So what happened to Grant after he was President of the United States? This is really where the story gets particularly interesting, because Grant didn't have a business to return to. He really didn't have much of a home life to return to. He and his wife, Julia, really didn't know exactly what they wanted to do next, what the next act in his career would be. So the Grants talked about it and decided that they would use what life savings they had left, and they would travel the world. And when I say they traveled the world, this is not just the sort of thing you and I might do on one of these cruises. This is a major undertaking. They would travel from 1877 to 1879 and go all around the world. And Grant would become the first to visit places like Asia, Japan, Africa, and the Middle East. And here you see, I've taken a photograph of him in Egypt there with a turban on, just to give you an idea of the elaborate places he went. When Grant was through with his travels, he had probably traveled more than any other American had in history, except maybe for a few sailors. It was an amazing experience. And what happened is he was well received wherever he went. In England, they called him the Wellington of America. He met with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. He went out and met with Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. And everywhere he went, these people paid Grant great homage. And he's such a humble man that he got along well with all these world leaders, and the press loved him. And in particular, the American press that accompanied him loved him and started filing reports that came back home to American newspapers, and they described Grant in such glowing terms of his experiences that Americans felt genuinely proud of him and connected with him. And that was something really special. And the reason that's special is that Grant had gone out of the presidency under a tremendous cloud of corruption. And it wasn't personal corruption, but the people around him had genuinely let him down. And when Grant went out the office, he was glad to get out the door, because it had been a very unpleasant experience in that last year. And again, the press was all over him. It didn't look like he could get elected. Traveled abroad, led to what they called the Grant boom. In today's would say that Grant went viral, and people started liking the man again. He became popular. And so when the Grants returned to California, rolled all the way around the world in 1879, they came back and they found out that there was a tremendous move afoot to make Grant president again for yet a third term. Now, Grant himself was not sure he really wanted to be president again. What he said was, if the people want me to do it, I will do it, but it's not something that I'm eager for, and it's not something I'm going to actively campaign for. But in those days, you had political handlers just like these people do today, and Grant's potential political handlers said, look, this traveling thing you've got going is working. You need to keep doing that. You need to travel somewhere else and send the newspaper reports back home. And surprisingly, after this long trip, Grant agreed that he would in fact continue his travels somewhere else. But he had a couple of restrictions on that commitment. One, he didn't want to go anywhere that was cold because he was tired of living in the north. So he said, we're going to go somewhere warm. And the second thing was he didn't want to go anywhere that was really too far away. And so they finally decided to go to Mexico because Grant wanted to go back and show his wife Julia some places that he remembered fondly from his experience there as a young man in the Mexican War. And on the way down, they were going to come out of Florida, they were going to stop by Cuba. Now, Cuba was not a great stop for him. They had an earthquake there while he was there. It was a very strange experience. But he did get to Mexico eventually, and he loved Mexico. And he and his wife went all over Mexico, were well received. And while in Mexico, Grant hit on a business scheme. And he was constantly throughout his life looking for business schemes. He was never successful in business, but he was constantly looking for business schemes. And what he decided to do was he was going to try to head up a consortium that would build a railroad from Mexico City all the way to the American border and eventually over into Texas. And he thought this would be an engine of growth both for Mexico and for the American states, particularly the southern states and Texas. So he was really intrigued by this proposition. It is probably because of that that Grant changed his travel plans. Originally, he was going to go west and again come back through the West Coast. But Grant decided instead that he was going to come back directly from Mexico to Texas and to Galveston. And he later said that the reason he chose Galveston was that at that time, Galveston and Mobile were the only two large American cities that he had never visited. And he considered Galveston a large American city, which of course it was the largest city in Texas at the time. So he decided to come back to Texas and particularly through Galveston. Now, traveling on this trip with Grant was his son Frederick and also General, a Civil War general who served under Grant, was one of his famous figures. So they were going to return from Veracruz to Galveston on a steamer that was called, appropriately enough, the City of Mexico. And they took off from Mexico. The weather conditions were fine, but as soon as they got out into the Gulf of Mexico and started steaming this way, things got rocky fast. Because again, they didn't have accurate weather reports back then. The seas got rocky, the storm came, and it was literally a question of life or death there for a few days as the Grants and the City of Mexico steamed toward Galveston. They were originally supposed to show up here on the 21st of March, but they didn't appear. And the reports coming in from ships that were out at sea were that it was so bad that nobody could survive. And eventually, when Grant did not show, some northern newspapers began running reports saying that nothing like Stairway to Heaven. Some northern newspapers began running reports that Grant had been killed and his ship had been lost in the Gulf of Mexico. And other newspapers began reporting this, and it was a very somber night, and some people stayed up all night praying for the Grants that they were safe. Finally, the Grants did arrive in Galveston. He'll arrive on March 23rd, and he's going to arrive shortly after noon, and there are lookouts posted on the tall buildings in Galveston that set off a shot to report that they had finally seen Grant's boat right off the entrance to Galveston Bay. And it was, this was such an important event that there's actually an engraving in Harper's Weekly of Grant's ship arriving there with all the flags right out of the entrance to Galveston Bay. And I cannot tell you how excited the people of Texas were to see Grant finally come to Galveston. The best way to put it is to say, imagine if Beyonce and the Pope and Elvis Presley had all showed up on one day. That's what Grant's arrival was like. Because people in 1880, they didn't see celebrities. There was no television. They'd see, engravings of people, maybe a few photographs, but even those were hard to disseminate. The idea that you would actually get to see somebody like Grant, maybe the most famous figure of the entire 19th century, in person and shake his hand, that was the biggest deal that was available, and people flocked to see him. So as soon as the alarm went off, saying that Grant had arrived off of the entrance to the bay, everybody in Galveston ran out in the streets, and those who could went up to the tops of buildings to actually see Grant physically arrive on his ship over at the pier. Now, the rough seas made it hard for the Grants to get in, and they had to change over to a small tug to be brought into the harbor. And on the tug, as it went out to collect the Grants and their luggage, were a bunch of newspaper men who had all placed bets on which one of them would be the first one to spot and identify U.S. Grant. But as it turned out, they were all winners, because as soon as they got up to the boat, they could see the general up there on the deck, characteristically puffing on his trademark cigar. And you can see up here, this is a company that actually took Grant's picture and put it on their tobacco to help sell it, because he was such a popular figure of the day. So when the people saw the smoke from the boat coming in, they all yelled, "Here he comes, here he comes," and everybody thronged to get to the waterfront. Now, think about it from the Grant standpoint. You have been literally tossed and turned for days. Didn't know if you were going to live or die. Everybody on the boat, except Grant and Sheridan, was terribly seasick from the experience. You finally arrive in Galveston, and you're going to get off the boat at noon. What are you looking to do? Rest. You want to get some food, and you want to get to your hotel and go sleep. That's all you want to do, right? Not here. The Grants get off the boat, and suddenly there's a 21-gun salute fired in his honor. There's the mayor of Galveston there, who makes a speech which nobody can hear because there is a loud brass band playing "Rally Round the Flag Boys" on a continual cycle during this entire event. And the mayor informs the Grants that now, instead of heading directly to their hotel, they're going to get in carriages and be part of a parade. And you can imagine that's the last thing the Grants want to do, but Grant's a good sport. He's been through it all by now, and he agrees to do it. They land at Williams Wharf, which is kind of up there near 24th Street and Harborside Street today, just to give you an idea. And in the back of the Grant book, A Busy Day in Texas, Busy Week in Texas, I actually have the parade route lined up for you, so you can actually retrace the steps of his parade if you would like to do it. But I'll do that with you briefly now, just to give you an idea of what one of these parades was like, because it's not going to be the last you'll see in Texas. Leading the parade would be the police, and you can imagine, just like Mardi Gras, they're there to get the people out of the streets so the parade can continue. The second thing is the band, and again, they're playing "Rally Round the Flag Boys" continually for this entire parade. Then there's the Galveston Artillery pulling some small artillery pieces, the Washington Guards, another militia group, the carriage containing General Grant and General Ord, O-R-D, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then the carriages with Sheridan and all the other guests. And they go down 24th Street. And the first thing they do, the parking lot right behind and beyond those restaurants, you know where that is, there's a cotton bale arch. And this is not a picture of the cotton bale arch of that day, but this is one that you can get an idea of what it looked like. So there's a cotton bale arch there that they go under, and it has a big streamer on it that says, "Welcome our guests." So they're heading toward the Gulf on 24th Street, and they get to the Strand. And what do? They stop the parade, and the Grant has to get out and formally review the fire department, which is lined up there with all of their apparatus, including the hook and ladder company number 2. So then they get back into the parade of the carriage, and they continue down a couple more blocks to Market Street. And there Grant has to get out and review the black military and social organizations. And those consist of the Lincoln Guards, the Rising Sons of Progress, and a variety of other black social organizations. And Grant does this with great humility and respect to his honor. They continue down 24th Street and they turn left on Broadway right over there. And right in front of this house, there is an enormous banner that is hanging over the street. And it reads, "Welcome to the Island City." And of course, that's J.M. Brown House there at the time. And they come back past Asheville, but they will come back here later on. Then they'll turn north, heading back up 23rd Street. And 23rd Street was called Tremont Street. And the reason is because that was where the Tremont House Hotel was, which was where Grant was going to be staying. So this is showing you the arrival at the Tremont House Hotel. Now this hotel does not more. Today that site is a credit union. But at the time, it was the finest hotel west of the Mississippi. Very elaborate thing. And my friend and colleague Kathleen Macca has a book in May on this hotel that I think is just going to be wonderful for all of us to read. But as they're getting to the Tremont House Hotel at 23rd Street, they come under a streamer that says, "We are all a band of brothers." Well, they may have been a band of brothers, but by this point, everybody from 24th Street has now run over to greet Grant at the hotel. So there's a tremendous mob of people that are to the hotel. And the police have a hard time even getting a corridor established that Grant can enter the Tremont House Hotel. Now, I was really lucky when I was researching this book because I found these two things right there. They were in a northern newspaper. They weren't terribly well labeled. But what it turns out is this is an advertisement that the Tremont House Hotel ran the next month following Grant's visit. And what you see there is this huge mass of people surrounding the hotel that block Grant's interest. And then as Grant gets into the hotel, there's a huge line of military troops that are escorting him to the stairwell. You see those in this other picture that they ran in the advertisement. And just to give you an idea of how accurate the engraving was, here's an actual photograph of the Tremont Hotel as it looked like. And here's an actual photograph of the lobby, and you can see that they just did a great job with that. One thing is just kind of interesting. Again, this hotel is to be the most historic hotel in Galveston. It has no historic marker there at the site of the hotel. But if you look at old Galveston photographs, it has this big tower on top of it. It's an observation point. And if you're looking at old Galveston photographs, the very first thing I look at is to see if I can see that observation point, because that gives me directions and it gives me an idea of the time in which the photograph was taken. So the Grants come into the Tremont House Hotel and you think, okay, finally they're going to get a chance to rest. No. They are escorted up to the second floor of the Tremont House Hotel. You see all those people? All those people are waiting to be in a reception line for Grant. And so the Grants will be there shaking hands and meeting people for several more hours before they are relieved. During this time period, delegations come from San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas, all of whom tell Grant, as long as you're in Texas, you need to come here. And Grant that evening will discuss it, and they will decide that they will go to San Antonio because Grant had not spent any serious time in San Antonio, and he wanted to take Julie up there, and he wanted to see the Alamo. So he says he will go up to San Antonio, and he tells the Houston people that he will come back through Houston. And the reason is Grant has this idea that he's going to have a railroad project coming from Mexico all the way up to Texas. If you're going to have a railroad come through Texas, it's going to come through Houston. That's where all the interchange was for the railroads feeding into Galveston. So you make Houston mad, and particularly at that point, Houston's in the process of trying to get a deep water appropriation to deepen their waterway access to the Gulf so they can circumvent Galveston. So there's no need to pick sides, and Grant tells the Houston people he'll be there as well. So that's all decided that evening. The great thing about it to me is Grant tells Dallas, no, I'm not coming up there. I always thought that showed great judgment on the general. Just to show you, this is the Tremont House Hotel was designed like the letter E, and here's the octagonal lobby we saw, and here's the big tower on top of it, just to give you an idea. And it's advertised as the finest hotel west of New Orleans, and it may well have been. Okay, finally that evening, the Grants get a little food and get to go to bed. And you just gotta feel sorry for them, because it's just it's only the beginning of this ordeal. The next morning, Grant gets up early, which he characteristically did all through the war and during the presidency. And he first goes around the downtown area with Mayor Charles Leonard, the same guy who's given the speech the day before. It's kind of interesting because Leonard had been one of the Confederate mayors of Galveston during the Civil War, but they get along quite well. Now, one of the first things Grant and the mayor do is that they're going to go over and tour the old synagogue, which is kind of an odd thing you'd think to do, particularly given Grant's background, but they decide to do this. And so they go into the synagogue, and the mayor has been bragging about how beautiful it is inside, and they go up to the doors, and it's closed. So they start knocking on the door, trying to get access. And it turns out that the reason the doors are closed is that there is an Orthodox Jewish wedding going on in that facility on that day. And they keep knocking, hoping that somebody will hear them. And eventually someone comes to the door and yells out, "I could not let you in if you were the President of the United States." Not knowing that, in fact, he had been that twice. Eventually, the event clears. Grant goes in and congratulates the happy couple. And as you can imagine, they brag to people forever that, U.S. Grant was our wedding. A pretty big deal. Grant then goes to the Galveston News office because, again, although he's not eager to be in politics, he is in politics, and he has to kind of keep track of what's going on. The best place to do that is the newspaper office. And he gets up to speed on everything that's going on. They then go on a carriage ride on the beach at 11 a.m., and the men are in one carriage, and the ladies are in another carriage. And the men in the carriage with him are J.F. Brown and a number of other big Galveston businessmen, so they're talking business as much as they're looking out at the beach. Then they come back to the Tremont, rest just a little bit, and then from 3 to 5 p.m., there's a ladies' reception, which again is up in one of those parlors where they have people circulating food, shaking hands for 2 hours. And after that, General Grant and General EOC Ord, who we'll talk about in a minute, took a stroll through town. And one kind of interesting thing happens here. When Grant was pulling into the pier the day before, everybody was excited, and some of the people were up on the roofs of buildings. One of the people who was up on the roof of a building on the Strand that was the Mallory building at the time, today it's a souvenir stand, was a young boy named Sweeney. And Sweeney, probably in his teens, was so excited about seeing Grant that he started jumping up and down. And he fell off the roof of the building. Dislocated both of his arms and broke one of his legs. Grant found out about this at the newspaper office, and so he and the general went by Sweeney's house and met the young man and told him that they hoped he would get a lot better a lot sooner. An amazing experience. Again, Grant only went to 2 private homes while he was in Galveston. One is this place, and one is poor Sweeney's house. So that's kind of a remarkable thing. And I can't imagine a modern president doing something like that. And again, keep in mind, there's no Secret Service, there's no security attachment at all with Grant at this point. Okay, now dinner that evening is going to be a big event. And when I say a big event, I think this may well be the most important, biggest, celebrity-filled, star-studded social event in Galveston's long history. If you had to pick a place to be one night in Galveston, you'd pick March 24th, 1880, at the Tremont Hotel in the dining room. So there's a photograph of it up upper left there. And the book has the menu from this event, and the menu from this event, it's like 37 items from all over the world. It's unbelievable. Each of these cities went, competed to see who could give Grant the most elaborate dinners. And you won't believe all the things that are on there. Culinary historians could study this and just get really excited about it. It's amazing. But what happens is you have this long dinner, probably a lot of beverages that accompany it. You get to the end of it, and that's just the start of the evening. Because then you're going to start with a formal proceeding that we don't ever do today, but it's toasting. And the way toasting works is like this. There's a central person who's the toastmaster, or the chairman of the event, and he first gives kind of a little speech if he wants to, and then he gives the first speech to the honored guest of the evening, and then they'll proceed with a whole series of people that give toasts, and then he recognizes somebody to respond to the toast. And this will go on for a long period of time, and on this night, it goes on for hours. So Mayor Leonard stands up and says he's just going to make a few brief remarks, and then launches into a very lengthy speech that you were almost certain people said, "Would you please shut up and sit down?" But Leonard says at one point, trying to make a joke, he says, again, he was a Confederate. He says, "We have been for a great many years trying to capture General Grant, not able to do it. But at last he has come to us and surrendered himself a prisoner. And gentlemen, will make the most of it. We will treat the general exactly as we think he deserves at our hands. We will tell him that we love, like, and honor him." Huge applause. And they sat down and everybody's glad. Okay, then the first toast, General Grant. General Grant, our honored guest, greater armies than Napoleon's have marched to his command, and greater glories than a crown have been his. Very formal type thing. The Toastmaster then turns to Grant to respond. Now, let me warn you in advance. Grant typically does not respond to toasts. On some occasions, he just stood up and said, "Thank you." On some occasions, he tapped somebody on the shoulder and had them stand up and say, "Thank you for the general," but he's only doing his duty and thank you for all the good food. He never gave a speech. So everybody was astounded when Grant stood up in the Tremont House and gave a short little speech, just saying how glad he was to be here, how much he thought of Texas, how glad he was to see the South and the North finally starting to come together, that together as a country we had so much to offer, and we really had a potential as a nation to be great, but it would require unity. It was some really inspirational and optimistic talk. And people were stunned to hear it. And in particular, northern newspapers reported this speech all around the country, and the northern press was furious because Grant had never given a speech like that in Philadelphia or Chicago during these toasts. And here these rude Southerners hold this dinner, and he stands up and gives a speech. So they're really kind of angry about the whole thing, but it is funny. So that's the first toast. Second toast is to General Phil Sheridan. By the way, that photograph I showed you was Grant in 1880, not Galveston, but that gives you an idea what he looked like in 1880. This is Sheridan in his later years as well. And the toast was General Phil Sheridan, who never turned his back on friends or foes. And Sheridan had been in command of the military situation in Texas at the end of the Civil War, and he was kind of a love-hate relationship with Texans. And in particular, there was one remark that Sheridan had made that really kind of offended people. Because Sheridan was quoted on one occasion as saying that if he owned hell in Texas, he would live in hell and rent out Texas, meaning that he preferred hell to Texas. So the chairman recognized Sheridan to respond to the toast. Sheridan stood up and said, "Well, I suppose I ought to explain a remark I once made about Texas." And the whole audience roared with laughter and applause because they kind of sensed what was coming. And Sheridan explained that he had been summoned back to come out of Galveston very suddenly, and he had had to ride for days, just getting off one horse and jumping on another through the dusty heat of Texas. And he'd finally come to Galveston, gone into his hotel, was checking in at the front desk, and a reporter had rushed over and seen him and said, General, how do you like Texas?" And he had looked the man in the eye and just made the comment about hell in Texas. He said, it really just kind of reflected how bad I was feeling that day. I love Texas, and I like it better every time I come back. And of course, he got a standing ovation at the end of his response to his talk. Okay, third toast. Now, this is a figure you probably don't know. EOC Ord, and the EOC stands for Edmund Otho Cresap Ord, which is probably why he went with EOC Ord. Here's a picture of it, and Ord had kind of taken Sheridan's position, and he was in charge of a military situation in Texas. And the toast for Ord was, Ord, a veteran in the art of war, and the sister arts of peace and goodwill to men. So why do I mention Ord and Sheridan and Grant? And why is that important that they're all here together at the Tremont on this one evening? Well, actually, they would be together with Grant in another very famous context. When Grant died, of course, he's buried in Grant's tomb in New York. And it's like Napoleon's tomb, and opposite him are some niches in which there are busts of his most famous generals. And two of the generals, busts buried next to Grant, are Sheridan. Him in, Robert Lee enforced his. So he played a really big role at the end. These guys have played a very important role at the most climactic event of the Civil War. Because Sheridan and Ord had both been with U.S. Grant at Appomattox when Robert E. Lee surrendered. They were at Wilbur McLean's parlor there at Appomattox Courthouse. And just to explain the mechanics of how the surrender went, Grant wrote out the surrender terms on one table on a piece of paper. Then Robert E. Lee signed a letter accepting those terms on a different and separate table. So as soon as the event was over and Lee had left, there was a scramble among the officers to see who could claim those tables. And Sheridan and Ord succeeded in buying the two tables. Now, when I say they bought the two tables, what probably happened is they just threw some money at McLean and said, this is enough for these tables, right? And they took them. But that is the case. So with the table that Grant had wrote the surrender terms on, and Ord ends up with the table that Robert E. Lee had accepted the terms on. Sheridan's table is now in the Smithsonian Institution. It's the one on the left. Ord's table, the Lee table, is in the collection of the Chicago Historical Society. And we have this marvelous photograph here on the right of Ord and his family at the former White House of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, Jefferson Davis's old house. And you can see poking out of the window behind them the table that Ord had gotten, the Lee surrender table that ended up in Chicago. But all these men are sitting at the same table here at the Tremont House in March of 1880. So there would follow other toasts, an almost limitless number of other generals. There'd be one for Galveston, beautiful Isle of the Sea, which was just an excuse for basically the tourism ambassador to stand up and give a speech. And then they always close, this was traditional, with a toast to the ladies. And the toast to the ladies on this evening was, the ladies, God bless them, our companions in solace from the cradle to the grave. They finish up around 2 a.m. All right, so this is really a tiring day for Grant and his family. So the third day is going to be mainly centered around some other things that are not related to military, and mainly going to focus on business things. And they're going to start at the cotton presses. Now, at this point in 1880, Galveston has some of the largest cotton presses in the world because they're shipping an enormous amount of cotton out here. And most of these presses are located on the west side of 25th Street, over there behind the Railroad Museum, kind of over near Macios in that area. And they're gigantic. You can see from the bird's eye map that these presses take up entire city blocks. They're filled with cotton and these enormous machines that compress it into bales so they can be shipped overseas. Grant tours some of these things, and they even give him a little souvenir bale of cotton, small miniature bale of cotton with his name on it for him to take with him as a souvenir. He then goes to the Cotton Exchange building, which is this beautiful building over there on Mechanic Street. And the cotton exchange was like the U.S. stock exchange. This is where people bought and sold in active trading and outcry auctions cotton. And there was a big giant pit here. And you can see a picture of the pit there, the trading pit, with people standing around it, bidding and selling and making motions. And then on the walls around them were boards on which they kept the prices that were being telegraphed in from all around the world. So Grant got a tour of the Cotton Exchange building, and the person who gave the tour was Colonel William Lewis Moody, who had been a Confederate officer and also had been at he'd been captured by Grant at Fort Donelson early in the war and sent to prison. But he didn't hold any hard feelings, and Grant and Moody got along very well for this tour. The next thing that Grant did is very unusual. It's a kind of an interesting event. He went to the Barnes Institute, of which we have this one photograph over here on the left. The Barnes Institute had been set up after the Civil War and was one of the earliest schools in Texas to educate enslaved people and their children. And it was a pioneering institution. And in 1880, Grant visited this. And he did this whenever he went to a southern town. He always went to the local black school to try and encourage black education. And so he goes into this school. It's a stage, and on the stage, hanging from the tops of the stage, there are two portraits. One is Abraham Lincoln, and one is U.S. Grant. And a young man named Willie Wales is invited to the stage, and he goes up and he delivers a speech. It's very elegant, really smart. And he says, "We've often looked with grateful emotions at your picture hanging there when it's hung for the past 10 years, but we never expected to behold your distinguished person. We rejoice the institution of slavery has crumbled into fine dust." So this was a big event for the Grant and the kids who saw it. He then toured the railroad stables, which is basically where the railroad trains were kept when they were being stored. And then he's back at the Tremont Hotel by 2 o'clock p.m. Rests up a little bit, and then he's getting ready to go to dinner. There's going to be another dinner that evening, but not anywhere near as fancy as the one at the Tremont House before. And so on the way over from the Tremont House, which is right over here on 23rd Street, they make a house call here at this house. And again, why does Grant pick this house and this family to visit? Well, it's because of Colonel James Monroe Brown here shown in this picture. Brown is one of these guys that had the magic touch. He'd been president of Galveston, Houston, and Henderson Railroad, and then he became director and president of the Galveston Wharf Company. And he had really seen those businesses into a place where he'd become one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He was also a guy you had to know if you were going to get into the railroad business and hope to connect to anything coming out of Texas. Now, everybody called him Colonel Brown, but it was an honorary title that was conferred on him because of his service to the Confederacy. But again, this, other than to call on Sweeney, this was the only house call Grant made while he was in Galveston. He spent a little longer here than he'd planned, and so he's late getting to the event that night over at the Garden Variety. So everybody is waiting for him there at the Garden Variety. And the Garden Variety in that time was much, much bigger and much fancier, had a lot more buildings and things going on there in 1880 than it does today. And everybody was waiting for Grant at the entrance to the brand new dance pavilion that's there on the right, which is really the only structure there that has survived. And they were all waiting out there for Grant to come in the front gate. Then all of a sudden they hear this huge amount of applause from the rear and discover that the Browns and the Grants have come back here to the back entrance, and they're approaching. Everybody rushes over there to see Grant and hope to get to shake his hand. Now this evening, again, there's no toasting, it's all dinner and dancing. Grant toured the grounds, which included a clubhouse, a bowling alley, which they call 10-pin alley, and a billiard room. There were tables on the lawn that were set up for dinner, which consisted of redfish chowder and oyster roast. Now that sounds great to us today, but in those days, this was an unusual item to people living in the North. And so a Chicago newspaper man, when he reported back the menu for that evening's meal, said, "This is what was served, and this is considered good food here." Just to warn the people that they're not trying to poison the food. And one of the reporters asked Grant, "How do you like the food?" And Grant said, "Well, it was good enough for me to take two plates of, so that was good." They then wandered around the grounds, which were illuminated by gas jets and Chinese lanterns, and then they made a ceremonial appearance inside the Garden Variety Dance Hall. And it's kind of a strange thing, but the way you did it in those days was you made a ceremonial promenade around the room. And so Grant started it off with Mrs. Brown on his arm. They walked around the room while everybody looked and clapped. And then Colonel Brown then marched around the room with Mrs. Grant on his arm as everybody looked and clapped. And then they exited the building and the dancing began. Now, nobody in the Grant party danced. Grant didn't dance for sure. The only party who danced was Phil Sheridan, who loved dancing, and apparently spent a good bit of time there. But they actually leave about 8:30 for the hotel because they have to get up the next day and take the red-eye train to San Antonio. But meanwhile, the Garden Variety was hopping, and the newspaper reported that the ladies were up till all hours of the night dancing with anybody with a blue coat and brass. They were looking for military types to dance with. So the next day, Grant gets up and catches the brand new Galveston, Harrison, San Antonio Railway. It's called the Sunset Route, going from Galveston all the way to San Antonio. It opened in 1877, so it's really fairly new. And it spent all day getting to San Antonio, and of course, everywhere they stop along the way for water or wood or coal or whatever it is, the people in those little towns flock to the train station and want to see Grant, want Grant to talk to him, want to shake his hand, whatever. It delays them getting off, but they finally get to San Antonio late in the afternoon, and as soon as they get off the train, guess what happens? A parade. And it's a parade through